Just want to say thank you for joining us. We'll get started in about a minute and a half. While we wait to get started, if you can introduce yourselves online.
Nobody's done yet. Do you want me to let
Who?
Should I let the participants in?
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, I thought they were not.
No.
I see 30 people. In the waiting room. Those people while they're waiting.
Yeah, trickling in.
Not for this reason.
Oh.
How'd you do? Is everyone on? Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. We will be starting in about a minute or so, but I just want to extend a huge welcome to everyone who is joining online. Thank you for joining us from around the world. I'm seeing a lot of you coming online, familiar faces and unfamiliar faces. It's great to have you. My name is Sajid Prelis with Search for Common Ground, and also the co-chair of the Global Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security. It is wonderful to have this important meeting where we're kickstarting this effort. As we kickstart this effort, these efforts are started by partners. And partners are so critical for us as we think about shaping and informing the field of youth, peace, and security. To kickstart it, I think I want to first introduce Golnosh Hakimtava from USAID, who is going to set the scene for why USAID supported this important initiative, and then we'll walk you through the agenda for the day. Golnosh, thank you for being part of this conversation, and most welcome. Take us off, please.
All right. Okay, let's get started. So I'm Golnosh Hakimtava. I'm with the Center for Conflict and Violence Prevention, CDP, sitting within the Bureau for Conflict and Conflict Prevention and Civilization. And I'm really excited to be here for this conversation. So we got involved because we realized the critical role that youth play in conflict and violence prevention and peace building. So, and our support for this work, this project, goes back to 2021. So we started our support in 2021 as a collaboration between CDP, the agency's youth coordinator, USAID's youth coordinator, and the Search for Common Ground team. This involvement included input and feedback during the design phase. So we were extremely involved from the early days, providing technical guidance, which has brought us here, participating in the SROI project's expert advisory group. And we've been able to also financially support this effort. And this effort was supported by one of the funds that sits within a portfolio that I have, which is the Reconciliation Fund programs, and that's people-to-people reconciliation program. So we were very excited when we found out about the work that Search was taking on, and we're able to financially support this effort through the people-to-people programming and the Reconciliation Funds. A little bit more about the Reconciliation Fund programs. The programming brings together individuals from different backgrounds to find shared values and shared futures, focusing on the role in this context, focusing on the role of young people in sustaining peace. And we've done a small assessment and found that actually approximately 80% of our work has had some youth component. So it's definitely critical to our work. More broadly speaking, so beyond the Reconciliation Fund program, USAID prioritizes the role of young people in our peace and security work. As an example, our new youth policy emphasizes the role of young people in building and sustaining peace and aligning our peace and security work with the pillars of global youth peace and security agenda. But we recognize that we have not realized nor measured the value that is created by this work and the value that our partners and communities can measure and have created, both measure and created through engaging youth and the perception of youth engagement as well, and the investment that we have in aligning youth with our strategic goals. So we also recognize that there are no standard indicators, or that we're not, and standard methodologies, cost-effective tools that young people can use to understand and measure how their individual or collective efforts can prevent violence. And this is why this effort has opened the door for learning how youth can more effectively engage in peacebuilding and how they can measure and how we can measure this change. So with this robust community of young peacebuilders that we are finding around the world and the history of sustained YPS engagement, Kenya was actually a perfect place to start this SROI effort. And that's where our Reconciliation Fund programs were able to fund the research on Kenya. And we are excited about this SROI project because of all these kind of efforts that we put in, and excited to see the future. So, thank you.
Thank you, Golnash. Really, really wonderful ways to kick off this conversation. Really grateful to USAID for being a partner from the very beginning for this. Also want to give a shout out to Mike McCabe, who is in the room here, who was the youth advisor at the time, who really helped bring this in as well. Mike, thank you for that. And great to see other old friends joining from USAID, who have been youth champions for many years now in supporting young people too. So fantastic to all have you all here. And thank you again for joining us online as well. Continue to introduce yourselves online with your name, organization, and country so we can get an idea of all the different countries and places you're coming from. Again, thank you very much. I'm going to kickstart this conversation on that auspicious note to share with you a little bit about what the agenda is for today. We're going to start off with these introductions. We have the introduction from USAID, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about why this agenda is so critical for the youth peace and security work. And then the reason we are all here is to understand what the results tell us, to unpack that a little. Before we go into key partner reflections, there are some key partners who are joining us online to reflect on what this means to them in their professional lives and the work that they're doing, and then close it with some frameworks as well about how this work, the SROI work and the YPS agenda fits into the broader indicator frameworks that are there, common indicators and others. Issues or question will raise this point as well. So we'll try to capture that in our closing remarks as well. So excited for this, and this work obviously would not have happened without the critical partnership of a lot of different organizations. USAID is our funder in this, but also our thought leader. You'll hear about the work at the front, top end. The organizational ideas are from the IOM, Search for Common Ground, IPHRD, Kenya Red Cross organizations who we assess their projects on. You'll get into details about that. But several other partners who have been with us, working hand in hand with us in Kenya to understand what the results tell us. And you see all these partners who will help shape the results of today. So it's not one person's result, it's a collective set of organizations who are supporting this, and the partnerships are growing. So to set up the scene about the global agenda on youth peace and security, many years ago, what we embarked on was an enduring change process to look at how to create an agenda that will endure beyond our time. And to set this up, the first steps of that agenda was setting up a set of political norms about who young people are. And second is incentivizing institutions to act on these norms. The political norms were framed with 3 Security Council resolutions, and now multiple institutions are now adopting this at the institutional level, from African Union to European Union and others. The third level of work is where the rubber meets the road. What does this global agenda really mean in countries where young people's live realities are unfolding and are experiencing increasing amounts of challenges? So this is the global YPS agenda over these 3 phases of work we have been doing. It's been championed not as an individual, but as a collective as well. shepherded through the Global Coalition, now over 110 organizations now in the Global Coalition, co-chaired between the UNFPA, United Network of Young Peacebuilders, which is the largest youth-led civil society organization, partnering with Search for Common Ground and co-chairing the process to really shape the global youth peace and security agenda. But I wanted to share with you 3 truths that underpin the work that we were doing within the YPS field, and especially around the social return on investment itself. The first was the need to move away from a policy panic-based approach to see young people as a problem that needs to be corrected, to a policy opportunity approach, to see young people as partners in policy shaping, policy influencing as well. There are the 3 pictures here. There are lots of powerful stories about them. I'm not going to go into details, but these are images of how young people are really shaped and being at the forefront of shaping this global agenda itself. Then the idea is to move away from a policy panic to a policy opportunity. And that's one truth that was grounding this work. The second truth that grounded this work was this question that we were asking ourselves. At the beginning, the most popular questions were, why are young people joining armed groups, terror groups? What are the push and pull factors towards violent extremism and the role young people are playing in? While we realized those are important questions, we also realized we're not asking the right question. And the right question we wanted to ask that guided our global agenda on youth peace and security was, why are most young people peaceful? So that was the guiding question for us that really shaped a new direction for this agenda itself. And this third idea that guided us was that the Security Council resolutions confirm is that young people are a political force for peace. And this is a really powerful thing because often young people were seen as good for sports and cultural events, but not political actors and their political agency. And the resolutions and the movement that is building around it is about making the case that young people are political force for peace. So that goes into why the SROI is so critical for us. And at the heart of the SROI, social return on investment, you'll get into more details very shortly, was about power. It's about introducing a set of power about a set of collaborative power about young people. One, within this, what the social return on investment is trying to do is to transform this sense of exclusion young people face. And we call them transforming violence of exclusion. And when we see the results that we're going to share with you today, what it does, it makes young people who are invisible, who feel invisible, who feel excluded, makes them feel seen, makes them feel heard, and their work valued beyond the traditional ways where we've been doing it. So we need to up our game, and the social return on investment is about that. Second is about improving state-society relationships, where there's a policy panic-based approach to seeing young people as partners requires governments and young people to see each other as partners as well, and see how that state-society relations can be done through new partnerships, the partnership with young people. And the SROI results we'll get into later on, it showcases what that potential is. And some of the speakers who are going to share with us how that is unfolding in their realities in Kenya and elsewhere. So to do this, we heard that this was set up by an expert advisory group. USAID has been a partner in this process, but lots of other organizations have also been thought leaders in this, from the African Union to the Commonwealth to UN agencies and others, who came together to collectively say, how do we think about institutional commitments to young people differently? And how do we ground this in a hard set of evidence that are helping inform a new way to think about impact and measuring impact of young people's work? So that was the advisory group that we brought together. And we also wanted to bring people outside of the peace building field to understand what young people are doing around peace building. We didn't want to talk amongst ourselves and tap ourselves on the back saying we are doing great work. We really want to go outside the field and bring experts in. And this is where we brought Shubha Kumar, Sarah Olson, and others who are going to help shepherd us through this conversation today to share the results itself. So Professor Kumar is being at USC, University of Southern California, who wrote a whole PhD on social return on investment, one of the thought leaders in the field. who are setting up the standards around globally around what social return on investment means, how to measure these things in an equitable way. So I'm going to hand the floor over to Professor Kumar to walk us through what the results tell us itself. So Professor, over to you.
Thank you, Sachin. Hi, everybody, and thank you for being here today. Very excited to be able to share what we did in this work and kind of what the results are. So as Sachin was mentioning, we embarked on this journey with the support of USAID to really understand how we can better measure the impact and the value that's being created by YPS programming. There's a lot of good work happening in this space, but the full impacts of these programs and what is the return on investment hasn't always been clear, right? It's been somewhat of a black box. And so we're trying to understand that better. And USAID was willing to take a risk with us to see is social return on investment a way that we can do that more effectively. So let's take, for example, most reports in global development, let alone YPS, they're focusing on outputs, right? So you'll see a typical evaluation report. This one is from Kenya Red Cross for one of the programs that they implemented, doing amazing work. But the evaluation reports end up being limited to, we trained 500 people, 30 people got a startup kit. But what does that really tell you? It's not telling you the full power, the full story of how this has fully changed people's lives and the impact on society. And so this is an opportunity to see how we can take our standard evaluation and take it to the next level. So in terms of kind of traditional evaluation, as I said, we're really looking at outputs, the number of people who participated in a training or activities, maybe doing some interviews and focus groups with stakeholders, getting some quotes to understand a little bit about how it changed their lives. SROI is building on it. So yes, we're looking at the outputs, we're looking at the activities that were conducted. We're also doing interviews and focus groups, but the questions we're asking are slightly different, right? The approach is really more of a bottom-up approach, understanding from the stakeholders themselves what they've experienced. And they are the ones defining the outputs and the indicators for measurement and the outcomes that they experienced. And then really translating that into the full impact. And the social return itself, the calculation is you're taking the total present value of the impacts and dividing that by the investment that's occurred. So I won't go into kind of the full details of how you do an SRI, but in big picture, the first stage is about understanding what the program does. So what are the key activities, in what location, over what time period the program is occurring. Second, you want to understand who's affected by the program. So who are the key stakeholders that are either affecting or being affected by the program? And then you want to understand how they're being affected. So working with the stakeholders, consulting them to ask them, what outcomes did you experience? Whether they're positive or negative, intended or unintended, but really gaining that from their perspective as opposed to kind of predefined measures that maybe typical evaluations are approaching. The next step, which is always kind of most complicated, is putting a dollar value on these outcomes that folks said that they've experienced. And then you want to validate your findings with your key stakeholders, and you want to actually share the findings and use those results to hopefully inform future programming and policy. So that's kind of the big picture of how we go through it. And happy to answer any questions in more detail during the Q&A. And so we embarked on this project, as Ganesh mentioned, in Kenya. And with the support of the National Youth Council of Kenya, we issued a call for projects. We got overwhelming interest. We got 300 projects from around the country who said, we want to be a part of this. We want to do an SRI evaluation. With the resources that we had, we narrowed it down to 4 projects that we ultimately selected to be part of this pilot effort. But we also, given the overwhelming interest, developed and offered a training on SROI for all the 300 projects who had applied, because we really want to focus on building folks' capacity to start doing this work themselves. And so a little bit in terms of the 4 projects that were selected for inclusion. We had the Young Women Leaders Mediation Project, which was implemented in Nairobi and other locations by IPHRT Africa. We had contributing towards sustainable peace in the coast region of Kenya, which was implemented by International Organization on Migration and CNCC. and conflict prevention, peace, and economic opportunities for the youth. That was implemented by Kenya Red Cross, and Project Anuba, implemented by Search for Common Ground. All of these programs were implemented within the past few years, and we evaluated them about 6 months to a year out since they occurred. And so the first step, as I mentioned, in doing an SRI is consulting the stakeholders to understand from their perspectives, what are the outcomes that they experience. So across the evaluations in this project, we consulted with youth, with women's groups, with religious leaders, with security actors, private sector businesses within involved, program staff who are directly working on these programs, community influencers, families of youth, and other key stakeholders who had all been directly or indirectly affected by the programming. And from these consultations, what we learned was that for every dollar invested in these programs, it generated about $5 to $10 of social value. You're probably wondering, how did you come up with $5 to $10, right? We're going to go through that in a minute. Why $5 to $10? Why this range, right? That may be another question. So the range is really about understanding that because of the stakeholder-based approach, that there's some variation in how stakeholders perceive value. So this is kind of a confident range that the value falls somewhere within this range. And to add to that, an SRI, what's a good SROI, right? Anything, as long as your value created is more than what you've invested, that's considered a good thing. So typical SRI report evaluations, you'll see most credible ones are going to fall between maybe $2 to $5 or so for every dollar that's invested. In this case, we found $5 to $10, and so that's pretty promising results. And I'll walk you through how we got to that 5 to 10. Okay, so there is key ways in economics that have been established for assigning the dollar value to outcomes. I know this looks complicated, but I'm just going to go through kind of the key points on here. We tried 2 different approaches to putting dollar value outcomes. The first one, which is kind of a traditional way of doing things, is looking to the literature to understand how outcomes have been valued in the past. So, for instance, in this example, youth said one of the outcomes that they had experienced was increased rehabilitation and reformation as a result of the program. How would we put a dollar value on that? Well, the closest thing that we found in the literature was the avoided cost to the state associated with reduced cost of reoffending and reduced substance use. There was a dollar value for that in the literature. So that was the proxy that we used to figure out how to assign a dollar value to them. Another example, so the private sector businesses that we consulted in this project said, hey, as a result of this project, we have improved community safety. That allows us to have smoother business operations, right? What's the dollar value of that? Well, we found in the literature the per capita economic gains due to the reduction in prevalence of local gangs in the area, right? So that was a way to assign the dollar value to this outcome. And you add up all the outcomes and divide it by the investment. This is one way to do the monetization. What we found, I should mention with the previous approach, that there was very limited valuations in the literature, right? So there was only a few, you'll see in purple, that we could actually find in the literature about some of these indicators. The other thing is that we found is that the perspective is always from the state perspective, how it's valuable to the state, but it's missing out on how it's valuable to the other stakeholders who are actually experiencing the program themselves. So the literature was pretty sparse in this area, and it was only from one perspective. So we decided to try another approach to putting the value on the outcomes, which included asking stakeholders directly themselves, how would you put a value on this outcome? So the way we did that with our local research partners, we created this list of common items that folks might find valuable. So a cell phone, a laptop, a car, an apartment. And we asked our stakeholders for each outcome that you experienced, increased peacebuilding skills, increased leadership skills, increased religious tolerance. Where would you put the value of that outcome in between 2 of the items on this list? We didn't show them the market prices for these items. We knew what those were, but this was a way of understanding how stakeholders prioritize the value of the things that they're experiencing in relation to common goods in the marketplace. It also allowed us to understand how stakeholders rank the importance of this. So not only getting a dollar valuation, but where they place things in this list reflects how important and how valuable those particular outcomes were to them. We also undertook another analysis, given that this was an election year in Kenya, to understand, did the SRI results change in the context of elections? Did these things matter more to you to have increased networks or increased peace building skills in this context? Overwhelmingly, across the board, stakeholders said yes. These outcomes were much more valuable in this context for us. And all the way up to, we redid the numbers, up to $32 for every dollar invested in certain cases. And so that's one of the beauty of SROI, is that it recognizes that the value of outcomes is dynamic, that it's changing depending on context, and that it allows you to really understand people's lived realities and how that's changing over time. So I want to come back to the example that we looked at in the beginning, right? So again, from the Kenya Red Cross program, their typical evaluation reports having the outputs, I know the icons are really small, but basically, it's showing the numbers of people who participated in this training, who the focus was income generating activities, and providing training around that, providing startup kits. That's the numbers you get, but it's not telling that full story of how this changed people's lives. So when we did the SROI evaluation of the same program, we were able to learn from the youth, actually, what mattered most to us was having increased networks and becoming an upstanding member of society. That mattered to me more than actually the increased income that they did, right? That's really valuable. That's really powerful to understand what actually matters to the youth that you're serving and that you're working with, right? We also talked to families who said the self-sufficiency of the family, to the private sector who said that we were able to operate better. We were able to add up all of those information, those benefits, and figure out for every dollar that was invested, $7 to $10 of value was created from this program. That's not something you see in a typical evaluation report, right? So it's able to tell your story in a much more holistic and accurate way in terms of people's lived realities of what they value and how much that's worth, and incorporating the different stakeholders. And so when we did this across all of the 4 programs, one of the amazing things within the validation sessions, the different stakeholders could really see themselves in the conversation and in the results. The religious leaders, the women's groups, the security actors, all these stakeholders, their values were included in these results. They were part of the conversation. They were part of the calculations and really included in this process and in their values showing up. So that's what we found particularly powerful, and what the organizations themselves found powerful. They had a now new way of being able to share their impact with their donors, with their leadership, in a way they never could have done previously by having this process. And it was, it's interesting to see how this is moving forward. I'm going to turn it over in a few minutes to others to talk about really what's the impact it's having on them. But to give you kind of a summary, the added value of SROI in evaluation in global development and in YPS is that it really encourages decision-making based on value, not based on outputs. Outputs don't tell the full story, but the value gives you a much better sense of what's the impact, what's the value, to be able to make decisions accordingly in terms of how you want to spend your resources and your energies. Second, SROI really prioritizes the voice of all key stakeholders. So that collaborative power that Sanjay was talking about, everybody gets, the key stakeholders get an equal say. Nobody's values are, weighted more heavily than others. It's about who is the representative sample out of these different stakeholders, and really getting that information from everyone to talk about what matters most to them from their perspectives. Third, the SRI process really allows you to get insights on negative outcomes that may have experienced. So again, you're going in there, you're asking stakeholders, what did you experience? You're explicitly asking anything unintended or negative that you might have experienced. That's gold mine as a program manager to be able to understand how you can do better, right? And how you can avoid those harms from happening in the future. It takes up all of that into the calculation, the positives and the negatives. That all goes into the value equation. Fourth, I think one of the key things about SRI, particularly in this space, is that it examines sustainability. So it looks at how long did the outcomes last for you? How did they drop off over time? That's value into the calculation. And that's key for all of us who are working in this space to really understand how sustainable are these outcomes? How, what's the return on investment now, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, to really understand how sustainable the programs are. And fifth, it's elucidating the value for money. So while inherently most programs have been understood as really positive as creating value, SRI is making that value explicit by actually assigning this dollar value to the outcomes. So in terms of the key benefits for investors and donors and program managers, SRI offers some key opportunities. First of all, understanding and identifying what matters most to your key stakeholders. Whether it was that increased network skills, or increased networking, or becoming an outstanding member of society, or some of the other outcomes that we found in the study. Identifying the strengths and opportunities of programming, so what's working well, what's not working well, and how you can improve it. Accounting for the value creation over time. So looking at an SRI at one point in time, how does that change 5 years from now, 10 years from now on the same project? That's really the value of using this methodology. Less so about comparing one SRI ratio to another program. That's not as useful. Sometimes you comparing apples to oranges, but more so about comparing your own value creation over time and understanding how that's changing. Are you responding to that? How is that making a difference? And then finally, SRI really allows local communities to define what matters, to define what the value is, what the impact is, and having more ownership as a result of that of this program. We are hearing a lot about localization, colonization. How do you actually do that, right? It can be tough to do. And so SRI provides a framework for actually implementing these things that we're talking about around localization, giving local partners authority to define what matters, to value the impact from their perspectives. And so in terms of next steps, our call to action is that we hope that SRI results will be integrated into national policymaking and national action plans, as well as that SRI evidence-based results will drive future funding priorities, right? It's coming directly from the stakeholders experiencing it themselves, say this is what matters and this is how we would like to see funding continue or change in our space. It allows you to really kind of shift the narrative around how evaluation is being done. And how it can also be used for planning, how we can plan for investments using this methodology, how we can evaluate investments. And I think it really deserves a shot. The young people who prefer this method deserve a shot to see, is this creating more value? I think for the programs that are being evaluated using SROI, how do they fare compared to programs who aren't? Are they creating more value at the end of the day and allowing us to respond better in ways that we hadn't previously been able to do? So I'm going to pause here and open it for questions. And in a few minutes, we'll hear from our partners about how these results are actually being useful to them and what doors they're opening. But I'll stop there.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. We can ask, I know some of the colleagues online will have an opportunity to type questions into the chat itself so we can bring them into the floor. And also open up to the audience here who is joining us in person, see if you have any quick questions, reflections, as you hear the results itself. Yeah, we'll take 2 or 3 and then we'll come to it.
Oh, myself as a researcher, right?
Introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, my name is Isolfin Latoya. I am part of the strategy alignment team at Search for Common Ground. And at Search, we've also been working on the peace impact framework as, we've heard of it, right, as kind of a standardized way for the peace building sector to really try to measure, right, our impact. And I think as I was listening to you, I was kind of like making mental notes of the challenges that I think we have been facing with the PIF, but also I guess it relates to the SRY methodology. So one is, you mentioned that you took measures or did the evaluation like 6 months or 1 year into the program, right? So I guess, I don't know if you can talk about the downsides or in general, like the timing, what would be a perfect timing to do this kind of evaluation? Because you can imagine on the one hand that the impact or the return on investment can actually compound time, right? Like, for example, if you did an interview with the same people maybe 5 years later, they would have said, oh my gosh, yes, now I actually this translated into a job, I became an activist, and then I'm now into politics, blah, 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 right? Like the investment, the return on investment can be even higher, right? Maybe not $5 to $10, but much higher, right? But sometimes it can be negative, right? I mean, the contextual changes, political changes, political turmoil happens in the country, and these people are like, well, I can't even use my skills anymore. So there's no return on investment, right? So I guess my question is, how do you grapple with that methodologically, right? But also analytically, what do you do then with an SROI measure, right? Yeah.
Great question. Thank you for that. And there's another question around peace impact framework online also. Any other questions? Mike?
So thank you so much. It was a great presentation.
Can you speak
So,
up so people can hear?
thanks so much for the presentation and the really impactful research and bringing this methodology to the youth peace and security field. I want to take one step back to at the beginning, the why behind this. At that moment, as we looked at the youth peace and security field, we realized that the bar was very high for donor investment and government investment in youth peace and security, partially because there had not been a lot of investment in research on youth peace and security, and partially because a bias towards youth-led and youth-serving programs for receiving that funding. And so I think the why is really important. Now with some fairly compelling initial research laying out a methodology, I'm so excited to see that you provided the methodology to 300 organizations to build on this. The next question I would imagine governments and donors will say is, well, that's great, but 2 questions. How does that compare to our investments with these other populations? And 2, how does that really result in behavior change beyond a increased value of networks and being an upstanding citizen? So the bar will always be high for youth-led and youth-serving organizations in the youth peace and security space. How do we try and address those 2 questions? And I actually open up also to my USAID colleagues who can think about what challenges this will face to change our own behavior as donors to invest in organizations that are often frontline peace and security. So.
Fantastic question. And also you'll hear later on, soon after the Q&A session from 3 other presenters. One is a friend of parliament, the other one is from the private sector in Kenya, and the other one is leading a national coalition, how they're trying to address these issues themselves also, and how it's resonating with them. So good question. Anyone want to comment on it? Shubha, you want to kickstart the answer?
Sure, that would be great. So I'll start with your question about when is the timing, the ideal timing for this? Fantastic question. Ideally, you starting with an SRI from the planning stage before you even invest to understand from your stakeholders what are the key things that are going to matter to you and how to plan accordingly, for them to define what are the indicators to measure, right? So that you start with that information. As you go along, you can then start to populate that information, but ideally it's from the beginning. Then at some point, kind of in between, while the project is ongoing, if you can do a quick and dirty version to get an assessment of how things are going and maybe course correct as you're understanding what the value is and where some things are going well, where some things can be improved. Then right after the project ends, but as you're talking about, there's going to be long-term outcomes that we're not going to see 6 months or a year out, right? So when we do this evaluation, we're saying, I had increased leadership skills, or increased business skills from generating training. I had better networks. 5 years down the line, that may mean there was less conflict. 10 years down the line, there was less violence. So ideally, you're measuring it at multiple points in time to really understand how the value is changing over that span of time. And so, some of the immediate outcomes that people talked about were increased religious tolerance. Okay, that's what we measured for now, but that could, really change the game 5 or 10 years down in the context of an election, right? So that's why doing SRI at multiple points in time can really give you better information rather than doing once. And yes, those numbers are going to change. You hope those numbers change. And as you pointed out, some of these outcomes are actually going to grow over time. And that was really interesting, I think, to us who are working in the SRI space. Typically, we see outcomes start to drop off over time, the value. That was not the case here. Our stakeholders said that the value of the increased networks grew for me over time because one leads to another, leads to another. So instead of having what we call drop off of the outcomes, which we usually measure, it actually increased over time. So we had a negative outcome. So we're definitely seeing that some of these, outcomes really value increases over time. And the more you measure it, the more you'll get a sense of how that's changing.
And also, Amy is also asking if this is relevant. I think you covered a little bit about this in short term.
Yes, definitely. It gives you a sense of kind of where things are at the short term stage. But I think using it again 5 years, 10 years down the line can really give you a better sense of the long term value. And also, I want to come back to you mentioned about how does this align with the peace impact framework? And I saw that question online as well. I'm going to turn it over, Michael, if you want to speak to that.
Oh, sure. Yeah, hi everybody. My name is Michael Schubler. I work at Search for Common Ground, Vice President of Strategy. So great to see everybody here and the whole crew online. I wish we were all in a room together. It would be wonderful. And I'm definitely the camera. So hopefully everybody can hear me online. So I wanted to take a moment to talk about the peace impact framework. Firstly, I want to, you mentioned something about the YPS work needing to essentially establish an evidence base. I kind of understood. And I think actually our sector as a whole, we kind of believe our sector as a whole is actually at a point where we need to substantially up our game in terms of the evidence base for the impact that we're having. The consequence, while it's been great that we've been doing outcome level and output level evaluations, the consequences of not upping that game to say, here's the impact that we have on whole society and the long-term impacts that we have on people and their life trajectories is something that actually in the unfolding political context that we're in globally threatens to actually undermine our whole sector. And yet we are quite fragmented. We speak about peace in really different ways. There's how many different kinds of different indexes and frameworks and hundreds of different ways that people are measuring. Even within our own organization, sometimes we would measure similar projects, similar themes in different ways. Proud that we were measuring our outcomes, but then finding that actually we had different vocabulary and different terminology and different data sets that actually made it hard even to compare and draw the aggregate lessons learned. And so we set about working with a whole host of actors all over the world, peace building actors working from community levels to global levels, to figure out how do we actually create a shared way that we can measure peace and measure our overarching impact. And we emerged with a peace impact framework, which has 5 themes and 3 pillars. And I don't need to go into all of the depth on this, but one of the things that's most fundamental here, the 2 points I want to make about it. One of the things that's most fundamental is that it's all about building on the insights of people's lived realities, lived experiences, and really drawing out how is that people who are living in conflict see peace? How do they define it? It's completely aligned profoundly with the SRI approach. The second thing I want to say about it is that it drives just like SROI should, and the peace impact framework should start to drive all of our accountabilities toward those with whom we're working. The accountability toward the donors is so dominant in our space that it's actually manipulating and warping at times of our realities. It doesn't enable us to set priorities based on what people really want, nor to be accountable to those with whom we're working. And actually, the whole methodology under SRI and the whole methodology behind peace impact framework is built around that idea. And so if we're able to kind of make that shift, that will be really fundamental. One of the things that the way that this fits in, another way that this fits in that also is equally really important, is that the SRI approach is one of the methodologies, academic methodologies that we need to use to be undergirding this broader framework that we have. If we're going to actually have the peace impact framework be something that creates a genuine evidence base that catalyzes the kind of lead we want in the field, it needs to be substantially undergirded by very profound scholarship coming from an array of different academic disciplines, not just the conflict resolution discipline, but from economists and political scientists, anthropologists, education specialists, et cetera, to really be able to profoundly prove the impact of our sector, enabling us to make better decisions based on people's priorities and realities. I don't know if that's anything else on that.
That's really helpful, Michael. I think Xander then share the link to the Peace Impact Framework in the chat also. And there's a question from Nika that you're talking about. Nika, your question will answer in the next part of the next segment as well. Professor Kumar, if you can take Nina's question, this is about how can young people be part of this process as they work with big organizations who are going to dominate this field? What's the role young people play in such evidence gathering and that, indicated in this discussion? Why don't you share some thoughts on this?
Sure. Again, great question. We would like to move more into the space of training young people so they can be leading on the methodologies as well as, of course, participating in it from their perspectives, but also leading the research work and collecting that data from their peers and assigning the value. So it's definitely a space that young people can play a leadership role, and they have been so far in the work that we've started. So we're very excited about that. And I also want to come back to Mike's question around donors and how this can be useful in terms of investing in one particular area versus another. How can SROI inform that? I want to caution against comparing SROI ratios from different contexts, right? Because it is comparing apples to oranges. So do we invest in youth, peace, and security, or do we invest in transportation? Very, very different areas. We don't necessarily want to compare over those two. It's fair to compare when you're looking at a very similar program, very similar context. But otherwise, it's comparing apples to oranges. Where SROI is really actually valuable is looking at how value is created over time within the particular area that you're looking at. And that's where I think it can really help inform investment decisions. And also, going back to funders, I think the localization piece, the decolonization, I think that's what SROI really offers an opportunity to put that into practice.
Great. I'm going to pivot a little and continue this conversation, but I want to bring in a couple of other speakers who are joining us online and bring in Christine Odera from the Kenya Coalition on Youth, Peace and Security. Christine has been part of the steering group as well, the expert advisory group, and also has been part of the conversation, but now she's leading the national efforts around youth, peace and security, national action plans. Christine, welcome to this conversation. Share with us, as you heard the presentation now for the second time, because we launched this in Kenya in December, how does the result resonate with a young person like you who is leading a national coalition? And what does it mean to you in your national action plan process itself?
Thank you, Saji. Hello, everyone. It's good to see some colleagues on the call. Saji, I can't tell you how impactful these results have helped us to even get the political goodwill that now we as youth peace builders in Kenya are getting when it comes to the conversation around the National Action Plan. It was actually interesting that when we pitched this to the Minister of Youth in Kenya, he quickly bought it and was already forcing us to start consultancies that will then inform a national action plan. Again, that could not have been readily taken if it were not for this valuable exercise, the SROI report, that then informs our next step as a country on how then to come up with better policies and infrastructures and institutions that help to change the norms that a lot of Kenyan young people just want to see change. One of the key highlights that the report highlighted was the fact that young people are looking for value in terms of network. You realize that in Kenya, you'll find that there's a group of young people who always have the funding. The organizations will always have money to do activities, but there are many other institutions that are youth-led that have never gotten money. And so through these processes, we are seeing a lot of these young people who have always been in the donor's mouth are now reaching out more to organizations that would not ordinarily get funding. And now we're seeing that behavior change start because of conversations that started with SROI. One of the things that we did during the research is to go deep to the grassroots to actually get the conversations from the people who these projects really impacted. And now it's been easy to have a conversation with them because they understand where we are coming from. So when it comes to behavior change, we are seeing a lot of buy-in, not only from the grassroots youth, but also from our governments, because now we are able to tell a story that is value-based and not just numbers. Because if you go by numbers, 75% of Kenyans are young people. So that has really helped change the narrative. What the SROI process done for me as a person, having worked locally and internationally, this has also just helped me redefine how I see peace building projects. Initially, we were very focused on saying, we've trained 10 youth in this constituency, we've trained 50 young girls in that other constituency. But then we realized that the value was not really felt within this number of people that we're trying to train. And sometimes it was language because we are focusing on the policy panic. We were using jargons that people did not understand on the ground. So now also just learning that it's not just about the numbers of people trained, it's also the understanding, the learnings that come from this engagement. And that for me has been a great process to now not only look at the number of young people that we're training, to also get to understand that we were able to deliver and they were able to understand by the language that we used, by the approach that we use, and also just focusing on their needs as the trainees and the people who are being impacted by the programs. Saji?
Christy, powerful words and really, complimenting and building what Michael also talked about. Really helpful to understand how young people are perceiving this result and how it resonates with them in their agency itself. So really powerful, and seeing how that is informing the Kenya's National Action Plan on Youth, Peace and Security to get the minister's involvement and blessing, but also to support this process because of the result is a really turning point. I'm going to bring in Ehud Gachugu from the Kenya Private Sector Alliance. Ehud, you have been advising at the international level on financing the YPS agenda on the private sector perspective as well. And you heard about the results. You read the report on the results. From a private sector perspective, what resonates with you, Ehud, as you hear the results being launched today and the report findings itself? Can you hear us, Ehud?
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, good evening, everyone. This meeting today and the results that we've just been sharing and discussing really resonates to with coming from the private sector standpoint 15 years ago, and it has been a very interesting journey as we look through the contribution of the private sector in peace building efforts. And our intervention largely sits within some interesting intersections. We're talking about the economic opportunity for young people, of course, today, underpinning finding around incomes, networks, opportunity has come out very, very strongly, and something that we've been seeing. But the biggest question has been is investing in peace building good business. And so based on the fundamentals that we've been working on and rallying the private sector to see this as a strategic opportunity and good business and a way of even future-proofing a stable business environment for business, we do very, very much resonate with this. Some of the pressing challenges we've been having around creating a business case for investing in this kind of interventions have largely been, where are the case studies? Where is the evidence that shows that if businesses commit into supporting young people in building resilience and urgency towards a stable business environment, then they're actually key returns. Stretching the needle beyond profits to people, to planet, and really these findings really are resonating very much with what we've seen over time. We also have been working on direct peace building efforts, And I must, acknowledge that this results then provides a very good template for us to elevate the conversation of direct interventions for private sector in peace building. One of our rallying program that we've been able to design together at a national level is called Mkenya Daima, which is a platform that brings all private sector together, working together with young people, religious organizations, civil society organizations. And the main goal here is to provide a national level platform, which is private sector driven, private sector led, that allows innovative solutions around peace building. And looking at some of the things that have, are coming out from this study, it just points to the fact that, working on an ecosystem approach, bringing together many partners to address the various intersections that, peace building process sometimes requires for it to be sustainable is really, really paramount and important. My last point is on the need for, public policy debate and what this means to national level. And I'm really glad that some of the contributions and inputs from this is going to the national action plans on peace building and security. And again, the question has been, where is the private sector involvement in all this? How can we build strong case that then helps in addressing structural barriers that impede private sector from participating in such interventions? And so, applying, some of the findings that we're using like today, where every actor in the ecosystem has a role to play and results and impacts can be shared and accepted generally through collective impact models, really is a very, very strong, position that these results are actually bringing in. So from what we are seeing from the results, the collective impact aspect, where every actor has a clear role to play and has an ownership of some results, is a very good and important finding that we believe would go a long way in helping to strengthen local action on the youth peace building. Now, one of my last points is around communication. Well, these results are really, really good, and I am really saying that if you look at us around the room, most of us are practitioners around this space, where's the private sector? How are we packaging information that then makes this more digestible to the private sector, to people who work closely at the policy space, for them to consume what this means and how this can be translated into actionable investment avenues and options. So again, having young people at the right, left, and center of the communication is paramount, because we know, as Christine has said, we are talking about over 75% of the population in Kenya, in Africa, being youthful, a medium age of 19 years. Meaning, even as we design these programs, as we bring in and service this evidence, we cannot do this without having young people at the center of it, young people being the drivers of this, because essentially we believe when we all bring this together, for the private sector, there's value. For the young people, there's value. For practitioners, there's value. For investors, there's value. And for government in policy development and evolution, there is value. So we totally are aligned with this. The need for more is still there. Having contextual solutions that speaks to specific needs of countries, of Africa, of other regions is also very paramount, and we have seen that learning thread across the entire results. So that is our quick reflection, and we're truly grateful to be part of these conversations. Thank you, and over to you, Sergey.
Fantastic and very powerful words of how this is resonating with the Kenya private sector coalition actors, and how you're seeing this as an incentive to get more involved in the process, in the national action plan process as well, and your role in it, the role of the private sector. But also take your comment about how do we package and communicate and brand this in a way that appeals to the hearts and minds of the private sector and the government better. I think that's a really important piece that I think you're bringing, that we should pay attention to and think about as we roll out these findings further. So thank you, Ehud, for that. And Nika, for your question, I hope you're getting answers to your question by having these reflections from Christine and Ehud as well. We have Honorable Ngale Daniel Etongo, who's a member of parliament from Cameroon, joining us, but unfortunately, he just sent 5 minutes ago that he couldn't join. He got a call, but he sent his remarks in writing to me. But he also said he's going to do a video testimony of how the findings are resonating with in Cameroon. And some of the remarks that he has shared with me is that now the results are in Kenya. He's a member of parliament in Cameroon. And what he's sharing with me in writing is that this is a result that incites the government, the parliament, members of parliament, to see a different incentive for how they can think of their relationship with their society, young people in Cameroon. And what is changing for him was, he's saying, we hear always that the median age in the country is 18 and 19, and vast majority of the population is young. But for government people, that's not an incentive enough to partner and engage. So his remarks are, the SROI introduces a new set of incentives for that partnership because the private sector benefits, the government benefits from it, from the SROI result. So it's changing that narrative of the power of young people and the contributions they're making. So those are his remarks. Unfortunately, he apologizes for not being able to join us right now. He had called 5 minutes ago to something, but he will do a video testimony and will include that in the video, so it will be available for others to consume as well. We're really grateful for the Honorable Member of Parliament from Cameroon to join us, and really share how members of Parliament are also seeing this as a value proposition. The last thing he's also saying is in Cameroon, they are looking at a legislative agenda on youth to see to complement the National Action Plan process. So the SROI results will order further cement how members of Parliament can be part of this process as well. So really grateful for that. And I see a hand from Shamil Idris, who is the CEO of Search for Common Ground. Shamil, come in, you wanted to share some thoughts as well.
Yeah, thank you so much for this. And I'm sorry I couldn't be there with you in person. Really appreciated the presentation and was eagerly awaiting this after we've been hearing so much about the great pilot that was been done. I wanted to challenge one thing, and in doing so, invite you to educate me if I'm missing something important, because I would like to be in a position of making the case for this as effectively as possible. And my understanding of what you've shared, to me, does not, in my view, kind of situate localization as the primary or even a primary benefit of the SROI approach. You can apply an approach that centers and prioritizes the views of local communities without ever referring to SROI or using that methodology. When Michael was talking about the Peace Impact Framework, one of the 3 pillars of that is lived experience, as he said. Taking an SROI approach is consistent with that, but is not necessary to that. And there are many other frameworks and approaches that what to me it sounds like is which doesn't mean it doesn't contribute to that, but what seems to me to be the unique value add of this, as I'm trying to wrap my head around it and how would I talk about this myself, is what Mr. Gachugu was speaking to, about the fact that it translates these initiatives into language that first and foremost the private sector can understand, because it speaks in their language and therefore can attract their investment and their engagement. And it can also inform policy debates that are had with budgets in mind. That seems to me to be, if I were saying what is the unique value add of this approach versus another, because from another perspective, I could imagine that boiling everything into dollar figures or euro figures or francs or whatever it might be is actually quite foreign to a lot of communities anyway. That's not necessarily the language to which a lot of people want to think about impact, but it is very effective when you're trying to engage the private sector. So I might be missing something important, and I don't say that with false humility. I really might be missing something important, so please tell me if I am. But to me, I understand that the unique value add here, the thing that this delivers that other approaches really do not, is not so much the localization agenda, but the agenda of expanding the stakeholders who can understand and therefore hopefully invest in and partner in this work, particularly the private sector and secondarily sort of the policy world.
Thank you, Shamil. Professor Kumar, do you want to kind of respond, and maybe I'll open up to see if the others here want to quickly react to that as well.
Sure. Thank you very much, Shamil. I appreciate your points on this, and I think you absolutely hit the nail on the head in terms of the value add around communicating in a language that makes sense to different stakeholders. So money is a common language that we all understand, whether we're youth, whether we're policy folks, whether we're private sector. It's a way of reflecting importance or value. It's not the only way of doing it, but it's a common way of expressing the value of something. And so that's definitely a value add of the SRIs, being able to communicate in a language that various stakeholders can understand. But in terms of the localization piece, I totally agree with you that there's other methodologies that are actively in place around asking people their lived realities and doing interviews and focus groups that people are already doing. I think the difference slightly in this case is that we're not going in with preconceived notions about we want to measure, did you experience X, Y, Z, because that's what we set out this program to do. It's flipping that on its head a little bit and asking, what did you experience? Blank slate. What did you experience from your perspective? Was it positive or negative? So that's where I think it can add a little bit to the localization piece, because the stakeholders experiencing the program are really defining what they experience and what matters to them from their own perspectives without kind of preconceived notions. But I agree with you, there's a lot of similarities, and it's really kind of building on that and taking it one step further in terms of the type of work that's already been done.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's a comment about more significant change, but any other reactions to Shamil's point as well?
In your description, the two methodologies you used, and methodology two, that's all about localization. It was what did people, I think as Nika just mentioned, what did they most value out of what came out of that program? And so, that's all about local context. And those who participated in those programs that were evaluated most valued the networking as upstanding the pathway to, change in their community. On a little pivot of a point on this, I would be really fascinated now that we perhaps have a cohort of people that we've measured this with to think about, is there an opportunity to measure this out a year or 2 years or 5 years and see what changes in terms of the social return on investment for it as, a unique opportunity to really measure change. When we think about Platinum and other people, you get to 9 years, suddenly you got a real story there to tell, and 1 year, 6 months, it's interesting, but you get this out longer, that's a real story to tell.
That. Do you want to come in?
Sure. I think I'm gonna just kind of put on not my USAID hat, but my former researcher and academic hat. One area that like really large. So one area that this work kind of piggybacking on that on the point about looking out further is that people's life and measurement of self-worth and association of funds with money, with dollar value, as we were saying, to their needs changes in the span of what youth is, how youth is defined within the UN standards, right? 18 to 35. It's a pretty big span that they can live a full life within those years. So the value of a computer changes from when they are 18 to when they're 25 to when they're 35 and maybe have a family and different perspectives. So I think in that sense it would be really fascinating. It would be really great to see how those values, and you're looking at the same population, same sample that has been used, and see how their values change. And then the other point, and I guess this is more of a question than really a comment, is that perception. I think there's a value on localization, adding that perception of dollar value to the actions or to the needs, and associating that, kind of giving that result to the private sector, and then bringing it back to local institutions, local NGOs, local, right? Just really hyper localizing, but with a dollar value attached to it. It does go back to that common language. But I think it also creates an idea of what people perceive themselves, right? If this can change from country to country. So, and I know this wasn't the extent of this research, but if we were to compare multiple countries, the value of computer in one country compared to another, I think that gives a lot of information that we don't currently have. And it would help us in the development world as well to see, okay, how do we approach development in different countries?
You want to come here?
If I can, yeah. I mean, it's music to my ears what you're saying, because looking back in time, like if we can do this in a year or 5 years, it'll really help us understand the value. But the more we do this and the more context we do this in and the more times we do this, we also can really get a sense of what is that range? Is it really $5 to $10, or is it getting narrower and narrower because we're getting a better understanding the more we do this, what the true value is coming to. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity to really understand. And that's why I come back to also, you don't necessarily want to compare SRIs from different contexts, right? Because in one country, or even in one city, or even in one locality, one stakeholder might value something differently than another, right? So that's why, to be honest, I think SROI is a hook. You get $5 to $10 for every dollar investment. The real value of this, in my opinion, is understanding what matters to people. That to me, becoming an upstanding member of society or having an increased network, that's what really changed my life. The SRI gives you an entry point to start having these conversations. But really the value is coming from the insights that you're gaining through this process.
Any quick reactions from online colleagues who are joining? Xander, Emily, do you see anything?
That's the one I chatted you.
Because this is around, Nika was talking about. So I think as we look forward in time, any other reactions from you, Mark, Stephanie?
Yeah.
I mean, I would say, the issue of output versus outcome is something that has been perennial, and how we can really measure impact. And the fact that something exists that really mirrors that and allows us to go beyond just their output level is helpful. And also hearing from local stakeholders about really what does impact mean to them. I'm fairly new to the YPS portfolio, but I think for me, it gives me a good vantage point when we're kind of addressing these issues that have felt impactable for a very long time. So I'll stop there.
Great. And I can come to you then.
And again, thank you for all this. This is absolutely fantastic. And I'm Mark Hannafin at USAID in the program office of the Conflict Prevention and Stabilization Bureau. My fantastic colleague, Stephanie Kuma. So I just want to go back to actually the equation for a moment and just think about the denominator. So the investments and how you derive your original investment. Is it like what USAID gave you, period, and the conversation? Or are you actually factoring in a lot of the other things that are happening? The time spent on projects by young people, the amount of like the in-kind, whatever it might be, the room, the land, the house, whatever that others give to you. And that's important because I'm also thinking as we talk about the private sector and the government and the reaction to the outputs of the SROI and how beneficial that is. And on the flip side, not just looking at the traditional donors like USAID and UN and stuff like that, but looking at private sector donors to think about deep-pocketed investors that are interested, because we're actually doing a lot of talking with them. I know searches also. There are a lot of private sector folks that are very interested in investing in peace. And what does that mean? And how does that conversation get started? If you all have any insights into that, we'd really be, I'd be real interested in thinking about that.
Yeah, please jump in. And then we have one more. Can you hold the stage one more and then I?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. For me.
Sure, come in.
My name
Introduce yourself,
my name
please.
is Patrick. Sorry.
Come inside so you can be seen.
My name is Patrick. I'm from
You can't see you.
right now.
Oh, yeah.
My name is Patrick, and I'm from Rwanda. So I came in late. I literally got time a bit from, but I tried to follow online while I was on the coming. But I spent about 7 months last year making a project in the Sahel region, peacebuilding in the Gambia. And some of our biggest struggles were around, being able to convince or appeal to investors, donors to be able to allocate funds, what we're doing. Most of the arguments where you basically just engaging the people and then surface level, they are more interested in seeing outcomes in terms of maybe a manifesto paper or a paper that can be able to influence policy. But then at the end of the day, that is also going to be convincing because the leaders are supposed to maybe mainstream some of the perspectives there are people in the ongoing decision-making processes were not accepting of what we came up with. So we kind of hit a hard rock at some point, and the project had to literally stall until the UNDP comes up and literally incubates and gives us a little bit more guidance. But I don't feel like going forward with this kind of framework, if I had it in mind, there would have been a better way of trying to appeal to these people and see that there is a bigger picture over simply the concept of outputs and quick outcomes. Just wanted to share that. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you for that. You want to know? Yeah.
Yes, thank you for your comments. And coming back to your question, I'm so glad you asked it because yes, absolutely. The total investment, it does account for, yes, whatever funds have been inputted, but any in-kind investment as well, and also the volunteer time, right? That's not necessarily showing up in other places. That's all part of what makes the total investment in this program, right? So all of that does go into what we call the total inputs in the equation. And I didn't get into this, it's a little bit technical, but I also might as well at this point. In terms of the impact, so the numerator on that equation, what you're looking at is the quantity of people who experience that outcome times the value of that outcome, taking away what would have happened anyway, how much is attributable to the program in question, how much of this outcome was actually caused by this program, how long the outcomes lasted over time. So all of these go into that top calculation in terms of the impact.
And your comment also, Nina, is also highlighting how this can become an advocacy tool to support your arguments as well. So fantastic. Any other closing thoughts before we close the conversation? I want to see if anyone online, there's a question, I guess, Katrina is asking. Gender dimensions to the findings.
Hey, Saji, I just wanted to jump in and say, all the great questions that have been raised on the floor really speaks to how, as young people, we are not taken seriously with policymakers and even sometimes the private sector. And you realize that is because of the attitude that goes towards youth programming that has been dominated by people who are not necessarily young people. So then this is also an opportunity, a learning opportunity for us to tell a story that is a lived realities of what we experience. I have been a project manager before. I know for sure sometimes it's very easy to have money to design a project, but then you realize the consultancies that have been done do not inform the project. Hence, some of these projects then do not speak to the issues that address the needs of young people. And then that has really become a challenge when it comes to even pitching to the different stakeholders on raising a case that is more viable to them. I mean, how good can it become for business if that person does not give you the time to even have a conversation that speaks to the realities, your lived realities? So that has been a big challenge. And we're hoping that now, speaking to a language that might be closer to what they are accustomed to, will start helping changing the narrative, because now we are at a point where, sadly, we are focusing more on changing a narrative than even proving that we are adding value and we are coming in as partners to the whole conversation. So it's ideally a double-edged sword where we have to prove a point that we are actually impactful and to even have a listening ear to the policymakers. So maybe this is also a challenge for some of the policymakers to then see that they have to come down to us. We've been trying so hard to move up to them. It's now time for them to also just come down to us and listen to the issues that we experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Christine. Powerful words from you. I'm going to see if Ehud, do you have any closing thoughts as well to share with us based on your reflections now of the conversation so far? Any closing thoughts?
Yeah, just also to really confirm that, I really like what Christine has said, and one of the things that we are keeping to struggling is finding the exact nature in which this kind of conversation can bring on the table is of value, and such that they're not recipients and give us into the conversation around peace building. So one of the things that we've really been very intentional about is asking what's the definition of the term investment. And I'm really so very glad to hear that we are looking at investments beyond money, but also the dignity that comes in having a process that is really very inclusive, that is win-win, that is really geared towards getting into the level where all parties feel that they are really, really, valued, and that's the level of urgency we're talking about. So really, looking at what the kind of outcomes we're seeing. Yes, of course, there are contextual issues. There are things that we need to contextualize better. We need to take nuances around even specific context on, women. How do we also come into contexts that are a little bit more fragile? How do we talk about, context around, urban, rural? All those divides are there. What is the role of digital transformation in advancing the cause of peace building, especially about engaging young people using some of these platforms? So I think there's still a lot of work ahead, and I believe that this results just opens up a platform for us to really interrogate our approaches that we've been using and looking this and future proving with what we see as the future of work. As I said, I think we're amplifying the role of private sector investments in this topic and in this area. We're amplifying the need for young people getting at the center of development action. We are amplifying on the need for us to use evidence to build up policies. So all these different buckets of our conversations need to be sustained so that we don't just stop the conversation as having a nice validated results into now moving more into a more intentional testing of the model in different contexts that I've just mentioned. So those are the sort of the things that I see as taking us from here moving forward. Thank you, and over to you, Sajid.
Thank you, Ehud. Fantastic closing remarks from you. Anyone, Michael, any closing thoughts? Do you have any quick 1 minute closing thoughts?
Sure, I guess I will just kind of highlight, try to run away from camera and bring me back to so I guess the kind of going back to where we started, the importance of youth for our work, for USAID's work, for the Reconciliation Fund program that supported this is pretty evident, right? And this is just kind of taking us one step further. So it's really valuable to see that we have the population that we're working with, but being able to, in some ways, quantify through multiple methodologies that are kind of coming in. I think it's adding for a lot of benefit for our long-term investment in youth and in the program that we have. So hopefully our interventions will be measurable in a way that can be transferable information for all the stakeholders. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you. Michael, closing thoughts from you?
Sure. I think out of everything I've heard, everything I've heard is very valuable. But Christine, it's your comments that I think I'm going to walk away with really resonating. We know that our sector has front edge has been youth leaders, youth peace builders have been the ones driving the next evolution of thinking and the next evolution of our sector for now across a couple of generations. And if we're going to grow the peace building sector into the kind of full breadth of power that we all wish we would, it's only going to happen with this kind of level of depth of scholarship underneath it that's able to track life outcomes of people because of the work over time. Actually, we've seen that from other sectors in health and education that nobody questions whether girls can go to school anymore for the most part, but that's because the scholarship was done to see their life outcomes and the societal outcomes impacts that happen. And so if we're gonna get there, we need to do the same thing. And this is a methodology that gives us that, a tool, in that path. And if it's youth rooted, then we have hope.
Thank you. Beautiful. Mr. Kumar?
Sure. So thanks, everyone. I just want to really extend my heartfelt gratitude for being open and USAID for willing to fund something that, has never been tried in this space before. I should mention that SRI actually came from the private sector. I didn't talk about the origin of this, but it's actually a tool developed by practitioners for practitioners. So it came from the social enterprise industry as a way of them figuring out what is the value of their investments. My PhD work happened at say, I worked in the global health development space as a practitioner for my PhD. I said, well, this SRI thing, this is actually really useful in our space because we're battling some of the same questions. And so to now be able to apply it in a new sector, I think has been really interesting. And, like we're saying, we're just scratching the surface. And I think there's a lot of opportunity there. I'm just really grateful for everybody's openness and willing to engage in this conversation.
Thank you. And, building on that, I think for us, this is just the beginning of a process to continue to elevate the YPS agenda and to look at how can evidence like this bring new partners on board and be able to tell a story of impact and responsibility of citizens and the state to actually change the dynamics that are happening in our community. In the coming 5 years, the young people are going to inherit massive amounts of challenges. And we see that reality that the SROI is one part of puzzle that we are putting together to actually improve relationship between state and society so that they can manage the coming crisis in a way that is benefiting all of society. People being the vast majority of the population needs to be engaged in that. So this is that. And you mentioned several times the longitudinal work that this can have, impact it can have. And we are trying to build the architecture for that into the SROI process as a way in bringing the peace impact framework to see how can all the different programs that are happening be able to tell a more powerful story of impact at a national level. So when the president of the country is addressing their nation on an annual basis, he or she can actually tell a different story about how the investments that came in on a transparent way impacted the private sector, impacted the government, impacted citizens differently. So that is the type of potential that we are trying to create in this process. So we'd love to continue this partnership approach, continue to see how we can improve on it. But on that, I just want to thank all of the colleagues who are joining online to be part of this conversation. The conversation will continue online on the Connexus platform as well. But really thank all of them, Mehud and Christine and the member of parliament from in Cameroon who couldn't join us, but thank you for trying to be part of this effort and all of you who come to this effort. Thank you again. Have a wonderful day.